All right, Mr. K here again. We're talking about brakes today, a little more because brakes are super important. And as you guys know, Ivy Tech beats them to death. They want us to beat them to death. State standards beat them to death because they're extremely important. And in fact, probably the most important part of your car. So we have a part 4, and we're going to have a part 5 on brakes. So this one's going to cover brake bleeding ins and outs. There's a lot of different things about bleeding brakes, and that's something that's really important, and you've got to do it right. So we're going to talk about hydraulic theory of brakes. Why do we bleed brakes? Bleeding disc and drum brakes, and bleeding ABS pumps or ABS blocks or ABS systems, whatever you want to call it. So why do we bleed brakes? I think this video will help to get you to start thinking right about that. So go ahead and pause my video at this time and watch this one on this screen. Punch this into YouTube. Okay, you should have just watched that video. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea. Main thing I wanted you to get out of that is that you cannot compress, you can hardly compress liquid. You can't really compress solid. Liquid barely compresses, and gas is compressed pretty easily. So when you got a brake system like that, and you are trying to force hydraulic pressure from the brake pedal, or I should say from the master cylinder actuated by the brake pedal, right, through these brake lines to the brakes at the wheels, you don't want gas in there. You want liquid or solid. Well, solid's kind of hard to move through a brake line, so we're going to use liquid. Liquid doesn't compress very much at all, so that's why it works real well, which is also the reason why we got to keep air out of our brake lines. At this point in time, go ahead and pause my video and watch this one. All right, you should have just watched that video. Hopefully that gives you just a good overview of how a brake system works. So let's talk about how do we bleed? How do we bleed calipers, wheel cylinders, brakes in general? Well, you got to find a bleeder screw. Okay, there's going to be a bleeder screw on calipers. It's going to look something like that. Now there's a drum brake, and it's actually going to be on the back side of drum brake. It's kind of hidden. It's going to look, or it's going to be on the back of them right in that area. Okay. So first, there are a lot of ways to bleed brakes. I talk about 4 different ways. There's probably a lot more than that. I'm going to talk about 4. And this is the preferred method. This is what your book's going to tell you to do. This is, if you take an ASE test, I think I even put that in here. Yeah, I did later on. I think I did. But if you take an ASE test, this is the method they're going to want to see you. This is the method they're going to ask you about most likely, or ask you what the preferred method is. It's this one. So put a piece of clear tubing on the bleeder valve, just like the picture shows. You want to have a container already filled up halfway with brake fluid, and you want to push that clear tubing down into the brake fluid. Go ahead and loosen the bleed valve, again, just like the picture shows. You need someone in the car for this while you stay out here. You're going to have them press the brake pedal to the floor and hold it, and then they'll tell you when they're to the floor, and then you go ahead and tighten that bleed valve. They release the pedal. That way, when they release the pedal, it doesn't suck air backwards in through the system. Let me find my mouse here. If they release the pedal and you don't close this first, it's going to suck those air bubbles right back out of here and into the system. And repeat steps 2 through 4 until you stop seeing air bubbles coming through this clear tubing. And it's pretty easy to see. It's not rocket science here. You can pretty easily tell. You'll get air bubbles about the size of maybe BB. Well, you'll get air bubbles that are like an inch long in the tubing. Eventually they'll fall down to about the size of maybe copper BBs that would be in a BB gun, and then they'll get to just little like points of a pencil. When it gets to that point, you're done. Don't let the master cylinder run dry. You've got to have the master cylinder have a lot of fluid in it while you're doing this. If you let it run dry, you'll end up having to redo the brake bleeding all over again, along with bleed the master cylinder, which we don't even talk about in this presentation. Okay. So you're going to say, well, what order do I have to do them in? Does it matter? Maybe it doesn't matter. It does. All right. Generally speaking, again, ASC is going to say you start with the furthest away working towards the brake pedal. So that means passenger side rear, driver's side rear, passenger side front, driver's side front, if it's a left-hand drive vehicle like we typically have here in the States. That is a general rule. It's not always right. It does not work all the time. Let's look at brake pedal diagram, bleeding diagram for a Nissan 240Z. They want you to start with the rear left and then the rear right. Okay, they're not going in the order that we just talked about. How about a Kia Sportage? They want you to start at the rear right and then go up to the front left. Okay. How about an Acura MDX? They want you to start at the front left, right by the master cylinder. Mitsubishi Lancer, start at the left rear. Honda Odyssey minivan, start at the front left. Okay. Hopefully you guys get the point. Subaru Outback, start at the front right. They're all different. The rule I gave you a few slides ago is a very general rule that if you absolutely cannot find a manual for the vehicle you're working on, you could use that rule. Otherwise, you've got to check the manual. Cadillac Eldorado, front left. Okay. So the bottom line is, as you guys hear me say all the time, you've got to read the manual. You've got to check the manual when you're bleeding brakes. You really should check it for everything, just so you don't get any surprises. But when you're bleeding brakes, you got to know what order you're going to do them in. Okay. So you might be thinking, well, geez, I think I've seen people bleed brakes a different way, or is there another way? What if I don't have an assistant with me? What if I'm alone working in the shop late at night and I've got to get this car done tonight? There are other ways. They're just not the preferred way. So here's an alternate method. This is probably the most popular. We're going to call this vacuum bleeding. You take a vacuum pump, just like what you see in the picture. You can get them for $20 on Amazon. You hook it up to the bleeding screw, you loosen the bleed screw, and you start pumping. Okay, make sure your master cylinder is full of fluid. Loosen the bleed screw, start pumping, and you stop when the bubbles disappear. It's as simple as that. As always, don't let the master cylinder run dry. I've personally not had great luck with this method. I've done it on a couple cars. I just didn't think the pedal felt as good as it did when I actually did it the two-person way. Okay, but if you got to get the car done and you're only one in the shop, you can do it. Bleeding method number 2, pressure bleeding. This is a ASC approved method. Okay, this is something that, if it's done right, can be very effective. I would say probably just as effective or maybe more than the two-person method, but you've got to have special tools to do it. So that's why I don't push it as much. All right, you get something called a pressure bleeding pump, which you see in the right-hand picture. You fill that with brake fluid and you connect that to the master cylinder. Make sure the master cylinder is full of fluid as well. And you start, excuse me, pump it up so you actually pressurize the master cylinder reservoir. I said 3 to 5 PSI. That's a rough estimate there. Again, connect your clear tubing to the bleed valve as you always have. Open the bleed screw. You're going to see brake fluid rush out of here because it's being pressurized and pushed from this tank. Same thing, wait till the bubbles stop, shut it off. Just keep going around every wheel. Again, don't let the master cylinder run dry. Okay, number 3. This is kind of my personal favorite if I'm working alone. Gravity bleeding. This is pretty cool. Pretty cool. Fill your master cylinder up. Make sure your car is level. You can loosen all the bleed valves at once and put hoses on them and just let them drip. Then I come back in about, I think a half hour, just to be safe. I put an hour here in the presentation, but come back in a half hour to an hour, refill your master cylinder, check your, tighten all your bleed valves, feel your brakes. If they don't feel hard enough, good enough pedal, loosen them again, do another hour. Just let them keep dripping. Okay. Gravity bleeding is really neat. always don't let the master cylinder run dry. Okay. What about ABS systems or hill holders? If you don't know what a hill holder is, it's something that was on manual transmission vehicles, so that when they pull up on a hill at, like, let's say a red light, push down the clutch and hold the brake, they can then let off the brake without the car rolling backwards, because the hill holder holds the brake for a few seconds while you let the clutch up to go forward. But the point is, these have to be bled in a special method a lot of times. They don't just naturally bleed with the brake system. Check your manual. As always, read the darn manual. It's the only way you're going to know for sure. Bad news, you might need a scan tool. You might need a $200 or $300 or $1,000 scan tool to do this. You may need to open a bleed valve on the ABS pump or ABS block itself. Sometimes those have a bleed valve on them. I can tell you on 90s Caprices, they do. And you may have to rebleed the brakes at the wheels after you do this. Okay. I threw that up there as an example because I can tell you that a Toyota 4Runner, or I believe that's a 4Runner, those do have to have a scan tool to bleed the brakes for the ABS system. And I threw this up here because this is the cheapest, as far as I know, this is the cheapest scan tool that will get you ABS brake bleeding. It's $200 on Amazon. So there you go. So you're going to say, what if it requires a scan tool and I don't own one, or I don't have the money for one, or I don't want to buy it? Well, we got some options. They're not great options, but we've got some options. You're going to have to force the ABS system to engage. You're going to have to force that pump, that ABS pump or ABS block, to open up and let brake fluid through, or pump brake fluid out of it so that it can push the bubbles out. And how do you do that? Well, you can take it to a mechanic or dealer, right? Because they will have the scan tool and they'll probably charge you $70 to bleed the brakes instead of you spending $200 on the scan tool. You can also drive down a gravel road and make panic stops. You can smash the brakes at 40 miles an hour and lock them up, and the ABS will engage, and that'll work that air down to the wheels. And then you can go back home and bleed the brakes normally again, and you'll be all right. Again, not the best method, but it does work somewhat. I've heard of this. I've never done it. People say you can jack up the vehicle, put it in drive, start spinning the wheels, and then hit the brakes, and it'll have the same effect as locking them up on a gravel road. I'm not going to promise you that. I've never done it, but again, it's a method that's out there. Of course, make sure you rebleed everything when you're done. All right. So all we talked about today is bleeding brakes. We talked about different methods, 4 different methods. We talked about ABS systems, how to bleed them, hill holders. I'm not going to get into anything else in this presentation because this is extremely important. You've got to bleed brakes correctly. Remember, check the manual for that order. It's not always furthest away to closest to the master cylinder. This time, go ahead and complete your assignment on brake systems part 4. And have a good day.